Spying on success, competitive intelligence, spying on success. What is the effect of bias on analysis?
Biases are generally formed by undue influence caused by personal experience, stereotypes, or societal pressure. When left unchecked, our biases filter our ability to think. Bias is a powerful force. After all, many millions of dollars are spent to influence the bias of customers toward one product and away from another. The best data analysts are often those who have identified and dealt with their own natural biases. Proper analysis of evidence is nearly impossible when the evidence is first filtered through the biases of the analysts. So let's take a moment to examine a few of the most common types of bias in hope that it makes our own personal biases easier to identify and deal with. Anchor bias is where there is a preference for the first solution to a problem. You could say that this is a "we've always done it this way" bias. This bias can be solved by implementing an ideation process that requires more than one proposed solution to a problem. Proximity bias is the preference to information that it was last encountered. It's similar to anchor bias, but it repeats every time a new piece of knowledge is acquired. People with this bias tend to follow trends. Cognitive bias gives a preference to information that is readily available or easily recalled. Sometimes this is also known as availability bias. The idiom, "when your only tool is a hammer, every problem is a nail," applies to this bias. This bias is a lazy habit that can be solved by a process that requires multiple pieces of evidence before a conclusion is reached. Confirmation bias refers to the tendency to favor information that confirms or supports a pre-existing belief. People with confirmation bias dismiss facts that contradict personal beliefs. This bias is a lifestyle bias. For example, a naturally optimistic person may ignore negative news because it has no place in their worldview. Likewise, people tend to consume news and attract friends that don't challenge their political opinions. Emotional bias is a preference for either positive or negative outcomes. This bias can be exhibited by overly upbeat management who insist on positivity. If you need to constantly see the good in everyone, you have fallen victim to this bias. Actively seeking negative outcomes is often the result of gaslighting or manipulating people into believing that their situation is hopeless. Social bias is a preference toward being members of favored social groups. For example, a survey question like, "Do you always recycle to save the environment?" encourages the respondent to answer with a social bias to the affirmative. Social biases tend to be more aspirational than an accurate reflection of one's status. Decision-making bias is one overestimates their problem-solving ability. It is closely related to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is a cognitive bias where people don't understand the limitations of their own thinking or abilities. Overconfidence bias is when we continue to make decisions based on prior successes, even when it is not rational to do so. This is a particularly dangerous bias to have in rapidly changing environments. Attribution bias describes the condition when someone takes all the credit for success while attributing all the failures to others. This bias also is known as self-serving bias or self-enhancement bias. In either case, it's not a good bias for a data analyst to have. Biases are distortions of facts, and they're everywhere. Human history is written with the bias of conquerors. Bias is an emotional reaction to a situation, frequently used subconsciously to hide agendas. It's important to know that we all prejudge situations, and that prejudice is the antithesis of analysis. Adding names and descriptions to these biases, as we just did, will hopefully identify your biases before they result in poor competitive intelligence.
Spying on success. Every day.